As we are growing up and setting goals for our lives, I don't think any of us plan to become a caregiver for someone who is aging, chronically ill, disabled, or living with a progressive and degenerative disease like Alzheimer's or Parkinson's. Some of us become caregivers gradually as someone we care about ages and they start to lose their memories and the ability to do the things that they have always done. And some of us are thrust into the role of a caregiver suddenly and unexpectedly, like my mother, Madelyn. Now, Madelyn would have never, ever dreamed that she would find the physical, mental, emotional, or spiritual strength she needed to take care of Quentin for nearly 7 years, or that she would become an inspiration for thousands and thousands of other caregivers. But that is how it turned out. Like all caregivers and the people they care for, Madelyn and Quentin had a life long before Quentin became a stroke survivor and Madelyn became his caregiver. They met in 1939 and quickly fell in love. She was 16, he was 21. The day after Pearl Harbor was bombed, Quentin enlisted in the Army Air Corps and he was sent to McChord Air Force Base in Tacoma, Washington for training. In the summer of 1942, he wrote to Madelyn and asked her to marry him. She bought a beautiful new blue dress and a train ticket from Kansas to Tacoma, where they were married by the Justice of the Peace. They had a brief but beautiful honeymoon at the Paradise Inn on Mount Rainier, and shortly after the wedding, Quentin was shipped off to the South Pacific, where he fought in World War II for the next 3.5 years. When he returned, they started their married life together on a dairy farm 6 miles northwest of McPherson, Kansas. Now, evidently, they were happy to see one another because this is what took place over the course of the next 5 years. Life was not easy on that farm. There was so much work. There were so many children, and there was never enough money. The cow lot was less than 50 yards from the kitchen door. But in the summer of 1960, we had prospects for the best wheat harvest ever. There was even talk of taking a vacation that year. And then, one afternoon in June, dark storm clouds started billowing up in the southwest. We knew what was coming, but we just prayed that somehow our fields would be spared. But when the rain came, it just came in these huge, heavy drops that quickly turned into hailstones the size of my fist. Now, the storm didn't last long, 15 minutes or less, but by the time it moved through, our crops and our primary source of income for that year were gone. And that was the year that Madelyn realized she hated the farm. She hated the cows, she hated the flies, she hated the smell, and she hated being poor. But she loved Quentin, and she had all of those kids to raise, so she had to figure out a way to make it work. She did 2 things that summer that changed her life. She got a job in town, and she became a devotee of self-help books. And every evening, shortly after 5, she would pull into the driveway, jump out of her car, rush into the house where she would change out of her business clothes and into her work clothes. And I would follow her to the milk barn where she would tell me everything that she was reading and learning about faith and about the power of positive thinking. Now, I will never forget the night she told me about this book, Man's Search for Meaning. Madelyn was 37 at the time, and she was quite attractive, although had you been sitting on the concrete steps into the pit of the barn with me that night, you might not have recognized that. She wore black rubber boots up to her knees, yellow rubber gloves up to her elbows, and since cows are not delicate when it comes to their personal elimination, she wore this funky 3-layer shower cap to keep the manure splatters out of her hair. The bottom layer was sky blue, the top was clear plastic, there were little white fluffy feathers trapped in between in the middle, and simulated brass earrings hanging about here. Now, I was 9, but even then I knew that was a tragic fashion choice. But I remember that night as she was washing the manure off of the cow's teats. She was telling me how Dr. Viktor Frankl had had everything taken from him, his family, his home, his businesses. And when he stepped off of the train at Auschwitz, the only things he had remaining were the clothes on his back and a suitcase in which he was carrying the manuscript of a book that he had been working on for 10 years. They took his suitcase and threw it in a pile, and then they took every stitch of his clothing and threw it on another pile. And that was the beginning of 4 years of systematic humiliation, degradation, and control. About 2 years into his time at Auschwitz, he realized it wasn't always the youngest, the strongest, or the healthiest people who were surviving. He wrote, "Everything can be taken from a person but one thing, the last of human freedoms, to choose one's attitude in any given set of circumstances, to choose one's way." Now, granted, no one would ever have any power against a gas chamber or dysentery, but for the people who were forced to work in the labor camps, attitude was often the difference between the men and women who lived and those who died. Now, Madelyn knew she would never be able to control the weather. She knew she would never have any power or authority over what they were going to get paid for their milk, wheat, Milo, or corn. But she believed, like Dr. Frankl, she could become the master of her own mind. Now, over the course of the next 3+ decades, living on a dairy farm and raising 4 children, Madelyn had plenty of opportunities to adjust her attitude, and she got pretty good at it. So this is a photo of my parents on their 50th wedding anniversary. They look pretty good, don't you think? Yeah, I think so. Quentin appeared to be as healthy and robust as any 75-year-old man on the planet. He was still farming. What you don't see in that photo is that Madelyn is losing her vision due to macular degeneration. Her back is hunched with osteoporosis. She has a scar that starts at her throat and extends to her breastbone as a result of open heart surgery, from which she's not fully recovered. She's not sleeping at night because of her restless leg syndrome, but the thing that is driving her crazy and frustrating her beyond everything else is the severe hearing loss that has been brought on as a result of the medication that she's been taking for her heart. And then, 13 months after this photo was taken, Quentin suffered a debilitating stroke. And Madelyn had 2 choices. She could either sell homesteaded farm ground to pay for long-term care for Quentin, or she could take him home and take care of him herself. If she sold the land, it would put my brother Larry, who farmed with them, out of business, and if it took all of the money to provide for Quentin's care, there might not be anything left if she outlived him, and she needed care. So she took him home, and she set about developing some new coping strategies that would help her manage her isolation and loneliness and the emotional stress of caring for a man who was now very, very different from the husband that she had known and loved for the last 51 years. One of the things that she did on a regular basis was to go to her wildly cluttered desk where she would disengage her emotional monitor and she would write letters to me in which she described everything that was happening and exactly how she felt about it. On Mother's Day 2004, I was asked to speak at our church about mother-daughter relationships, and I decided I wanted people to know who my mother had been in her own words. So I went out to the garage and took down a large cardboard moving box my husband had labeled Letters from Madelyn. I shared a few excerpts from one of my favorite letters, and I told a couple of stories, and people came up to me afterward and said, "You have to write a book." So I did. Letters from Madelyn, Chronicles of a Caregiver. So whenever you're ready, buckle up and watch. And for this, I take vitamins. It is the letter that she sent to me that started everything.